So we're going to try and tease out, I suppose, some of the several concepts and questions that were touched upon in Professor Nicholas Boyle's lecture, applying these to where we are today and to the challenges, I suppose, that face us in the current context. We have 4 speakers whose profiles are in the programme, so I'm not going to go into great detail on them. So very briefly, beside me we have Peter Millar, who was born in Bangor in County Down. He has in his past worked for Reuters, the Sunday Telegraph, Sunday Times and the European, and in 1989 he had the great distinction of being named UK Foreign Correspondent of the Year. He is author of 10 books, including The Berlin Wall and The Germans and Europe, and he's very welcome today. David Johnston is currently the director of the Centre for Translation and Interpreting in Queen's University. Noelle O'Connell was appointed Executive Director of the European Movement Ireland in April 2011. She's been a member of the board of the Alliance Française Irlande. She is also a member of the Institute of Directors and CIPD and is Fellow of the Irish Institute of Training and Development. She has a Master's in International Relations from the University of Edinburgh and a BA from UCC. And our 4th speaker is Dr. Mary Canning. She's a former lead educational specialist for the World Bank. She served on the board of the Higher Education Authority. She was appointed to the National Strategic Review of Higher Education in Ireland. She was appointed Senior Vice President of the Academy in March 2018, so our congratulations on that appointment. And she currently chairs the Academy Working Group on Culture and Heritage. So 4 very different people and 4 very different perspectives, I think, that they're going to bring to bear on this question.
In considering today, I considered the European Social Survey of 2016, where more than the European average, the Irish more strongly appreciate the cultural benefits that the changes have brought, particularly immigration, because the quality of our lives have changed. And looking at some of the numbers and how that's reflecting, the recent census, about 10% of the population now was born somewhere else or comes from a different background. The employment in Ireland, 2008, 8% of the total of the Irish population came from somewhere else. And yet there's been no backlash here the way there has been in the UK. And that, I think, is a phenomenon which would require further analysis and discussion. I would suggest that culture in this sense is the glue that is holding us together. It is not a badge of reaction, as it seems to have become in the UK. And again, this is something that probably, as the years go by, will become the subject of more social or anthropological studies. We could suggest reasons for it, reasons that perhaps go back into Irish history that don't get discussed very much. But if you mention Salamanca, Rome, Paris, or Louvain in the context of 17th or 18th century Ireland, people reacted to that instantly because, of course, that was the lifeline to the culture of the European mainland, which was not the culture of our closest neighbour.
I had been brought up in a fairly unionist family, in fact quite a strict, well, part of my family were very strict, to the extent of marching me to Finicky Field, age 6, with an orange sash. When I got there, I said the speeches I didn't understand, all referring to the Pope in Rome as a harlot of Babylon, which led the 6-year-old to ask some very inconvenient questions of his mother at the time. I did, however, feel that I was very definitely in love with the whole concept of Europe, but yet it wasn't very real to me at the time then. On my 18th birthday, it was just after the time that both Ireland and the United Kingdom joined the European Union. I took up an Irish passport straight away and was delighted to say that I was considered myself a strong Irishman and a strong European. In Reuters, they immediately sent me to Brussels. So from the very beginning of my professional career, the EU played a role in it. I was in Poland for the first free Polish elections. I was in Vienna, Budapest, and on the border on the day the Hungarians opened the border to the west. I was in Prague the day the Communist Party resigned, and I was in Berlin the night the wall came down, most deliciously for me.
Like Peter, I marched to the Finnehay Field, although I was 8. I didn't understand anything either, but I was delighted to belong. The men in the bowler hats and the swords, they frightened me, but I knew they would also protect me. I knew that they would keep at bay the personality disorder who threatened my world and who threatened my identity. I didn't meet or know any Catholics. I grew up in the Craigie estate, so George Best is something else we have in common. I didn't meet any Catholics until I went to university. So that's who I am. What you think of me matters also, because we become ourselves in the mirror of others. I'm always very struck when I read Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, how Fanon only becomes aware of what he calls the fact of blackness when he meets white soldiers from metropolitan France, when they confirm his sense of identity to him. Identity in the North is, or has been, it's changing, and that's what I want to come to. Identity has been constructed along a sense of binary opposition, a terrible dyadic unity, where we haven't known each other, but we've created each other in resentment and in fear and in apprehension. So that to an 8-year-old imagination, a man in a bowler hat, and what I now realise was probably a tin sword, could actually save me from a descent into chaos, from being hijacked by history. For that reason, I think that a multiple identity is not necessarily a sign of personality disorder. Multiple identity is a richness of self. Multiple identity emerges as a series of enriching palimpsests from our encounter with all the things beyond us that we are not.
That support that Irish people have for our continued European Union involvement and membership, I think it has promoted and enhanced our sense of Europeanness in the wake of Brexit. It also outlines what we do, I think, as a country and as a people in terms of participatory democracy very well. Since 2012, over 90,000 primary school children, through the auspices of the Blue Star programme, are learning about Europe in a very curriculum-friendly manner. What does this involve? It means, for example, I returned to my old primary school 3 years ago to see the work that they are doing in a rural area in Cork. When I was in school, everybody there was in a 3-mile radius. Now it is absolutely fantastic to see how multicultural, going back to the theme of today's conference, how multicultural the school is, the school community, the parents are, and how Lithuanians are talking about their culture, bringing that to bear, how we are seeing the Polish community and the primary school children from that background also sharing and learning, and it's creating a very integrated and multicultural Irish society, which I think is only stands to better further develop and enhance Ireland going forward.
We were asked to consider benefits. I would suggest, and of course we would go beyond the economy, far beyond the economy, not just standing in the EU line at the airport because we've got an EU passport, but, and the ambassador mentioned some of this morning, the huge benefits that the Erasmus programme has brought to Ireland, the huge exchange of culture and experience that our young people are receiving across the continent, but we also are receiving from the incoming flows of students. The research grants in which you academics are cooperating with all your European counterparts, and the benefits of that flow right through not just this society, but of course Europe in general.
Brexit terrifies me, because I'm worried about being left behind in the north again. I'm worried that what is happening with the border has brought the border back in to our imaginary, has brought the border back in as a possible physical location. I'm worried that we're becoming increasingly exiled from sources of funding in Europe and from the creative, cultural and political projects that those sources of funding seek to both sustain and develop.
We commissioned Red C to ask 1,000 people throughout the country on where they saw themselves, on where they saw Ireland and the European Union, and particularly through the goggles of Brexit. Interestingly, this year, for the first time in our poll since 2013, the highest level of support for Ireland's continuing membership of the European Union came across at 92%. That's the highest it has ever been since we first started polling. So it got a lot of traction, but it also proved that there's very little evidence, contrary to the best efforts of some, that the Irish people support the view that we also should follow the UK out of the EU. Support for that idea has dropped by over 18%. When we first posed that question as a hypothetical in 2013, it stood at 30%. Sadly, this year when we posed the question, only 11% said that Ireland should follow the UK out of the EU. So that's, those are very, very high statistics. 2018, its designation as the European Year of Cultural Heritage is unanimously supported by both institutions and the member states. And I think this is now a time of significant political momentum for collaboration on culture. And in terms of looking at where do people see themselves from an identity perspective, in recent Eurobarometer surveys, 41% of respondents felt that EU member states are distant in terms of values. But culture, interestingly, topped the list of factors most likely to create a sense of community among citizens. So there is a huge opportunity there.
One of the great things that Europe has brought to the North, and our first real imagination of Europe, started to come with Field Day, Brian Friel, and the work that people like Seamus Heaney, Seamus Dean, and so on did with Field Day was they brought in plays in translation, they brought in visions from outside, they dared us to imagine alternatives. And these alternatives came to us with a sense of something different from outside. And then John Hume picked up on that. John Hume began to speculate on the influence of Europe in tearing apart that terrible dyadic unity that kept us so imprisoned in our two different identities in the North. The Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, or the 1998 Agreement, and it depends on your persuasion as to which name you want to give to that. The agreement had as its guarantor the presence of Europe. Europe made the Good Friday Agreement happen. And let's be absolutely frank, the Good Friday Agreement in some ways has not worked. In some ways, it's worked with a spectacular success. It hasn't worked in the way in which it has replicated sectarian politics at the heart of the Assembly. It has worked in the way in which we no longer shoot each other. We no longer bomb each other. But more than that, we no longer think of ourselves, or many of us no longer think of ourselves in terms of this dyadic unity, these binary ways of being. At the last research project that I saw now says that about 48% of people in the north of Ireland do not think of themselves as either nationalist or unionist, have pulled away from the two different sets of mind, two different ways of thinking about each other that nationalism and unionism mean in the north. That growing middle ground has been largely ignored in the way in which the British government has begun to think about what might happen with the border.
I think that Europe has inadequately explained itself in many areas. I worked for several years in both Hungary and then subsequently in Poland, both during the pre-accession process and then later when I was posted there from the World Bank. And I saw what the membership of the European Union did for the post-communist system in Central and Eastern Europe. And I saw and witnessed at first hand the desperation of many of the countries which now seem to be challenging the values of the EU, their desperation to join. And our thoughts have to go out to our colleagues in the Central European University in Budapest at the moment, who are fighting an existential threat, which is the illiberal issues that are being flung at it by the Orban government. So there are huge issues, and I think we should really be focusing a little bit now on things that we, thinking about this, and the people in this room think about this a lot, what is it that we can do? The European Union, yes, Noelle is right. It hasn't explained itself on many levels. There is perceived to be a democratic deficit. I would not agree that there was, but that is a perception. And there are many faults, but the question is, what would we do without it?
I think it behoves us all to make the positive and constructive case for our Ireland and Europe. What we gain from being a part of the EU, certainly, but also what does the European Union gain from being a part from Ireland, being an active and committed and constructive member. And I think it's welcome and it's encouraging to see that increase in engagement and proactivity, particularly, I suppose, the challenges that Brexit has created in that regard. If there's any silver lining, it is that it has caused us maybe to cast aside the comfort blanket of our big brother and next door neighbour, but also to try and assert our own place on the European stage with confidence and commitment. Thank you.